So today we're going to start 6.1, racial discrimination. The objective for today is students will be able to explain discrimination African Americans faced after Reconstruction ended. The essential questions that you're going to be able to answer by the end of the lesson is, and this should actually be 6.1, my apologies, you guys. So the essential questions that you all should be able to answer by the end of today's lesson is, what forms did racial discrimination take in the South after Reconstruction? So what did that look like? And then how did Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois differ in the responses to racial discrimination in the South? Okay, racial discrimination in the South. Jim Crow laws were laws passed in the South that limited rights of African Americans. This is where we would see the whites only signs or colored only. We tended to see this type of segregation in a lot of public places. So things like a theater, restaurants, even the Smithsonian's were all segregated. The second type of racial discrimination seen in the South was limiting the voting rights. Remember, African Americans were given the right to vote after the end of the Civil War, and it allowed the amount of African Americans who could hold public office, because that was a fear for them. And they did this by having a poll tax. So you had to pay to vote. Most African Americans didn't have the money to vote necessarily, so that would prevent them from voting. The second one was a literacy test. So you had to prove that you could read or write in order to vote. But again, remember, most African Americans weren't educated because they weren't allowed to be educated as slaves. And then that led us to the 1986 Plessy versus Ferguson separate but equal case, which we're actually going to talk a little bit more about on the next slide. So I'm not going to go too much into detail about it right here. And these are two examples of Jim Crow laws. Plessy versus Ferguson. This right here is Homer Plessy. Homer Plessy was 1/8 African American. And he refused to move from the white train car. So it went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court decided that you could have separate accommodations if it is equal. Now, what we all know is that it wasn't actually equal, right? Just because you had the white train car and the African American train car didn't mean they were the same type of train car. So we know that that was not necessarily promised the equal part. There were three prominent African American leaders during the time period that had a different response on what to do or how to handle the discrimination that many African Americans were facing. The first is Booker T. Washington. He established the Tuskegee Institute. I should say Booker. I remember him because Booker T, the T stands for Tuskegee. And he was a big advocate of what we'd call industrial education. So maybe more like a trade school. The second that we have, and you're going to read a little bit more about him in your assignment today, is W.E.B. Du Bois. And what we know about him was that he said that blacks need to have full political equality. In order to receive civil rights. He also established the NAACP. So he was much more about African Americans should be educated, African Americans need to go to college, whereas Booker T. Washington was a little bit more of let's not to get ahead of ourselves. Maybe we should just get people on their feet and get them jobs before we worry about getting people into politics. Ida B. Wells was an advocate or fought against, I should put her name first. So this is Ida B. Wells. And she fought against lynching. Now remember, there were 2 lynchings here in the city of Alexandria. And between the years of 1862 and 1930, 5,000 African Americans were lynched. And most of them were blacks from the South. So because of the consistent discrimination in the South, many African Americans decided to move northward in what we call the Great Migration. And this is where we saw 6 million African Americans move from the rural South to the North and look for a better life and better jobs. Also with a hope that discrimination would decrease. This went on from 1916 to 1970, and many still face discrimination. It may not have been as hard per se, but and here you can see a picture of a family that probably was moving northward at some point during this time period. Okay, and finally, the final step to discrimination is actually eugenics. And eugenics took place in Virginia. Eugenics is when you discourage the reproduction of those with undesirable traits. So this could be anybody that would be deemed undesirable, then should be what we call sterilized, which means unable to have children. So there's a very famous court case, Buck versus Bell, and this happened in Virginia, where Buck became pregnant. And so you're going to read a little bit more about the case. But essentially what they said was that Buck was undesirable or unfit to have children. And that resulted in them sterilizing her. And so this went to the Supreme Court on the legality of this case. And that is it for today.